The night was cold, the kind of cold that turned your breath into a thick fog in the air. Jason and Michael, holding hands, stood there, at the door of a place they never imagined they would visit, the children's shelter for at-risk youth. They exchanged silent glances, trying to hold back the mix of nervousness and anticipation consuming them. "Do you think we're ready?" Michael asked, his voice trembling, though he tried to hide it. Jason looked at him, attempting to conceal his own anxiety, but failing. "We are," he replied with more confidence than he felt. "We've done what we could. Now it's time to take the next step." They were there because they had made a decision that would change their lives. After years of trying to conceive, after unsuccessful IVF attempts, and after much reflection, they had chosen adoption. Not due to a lack of love or desire, but because they felt it might be the only way to create the family they had always dreamed of. However, the process hadn't been easy. The adoption service requirements were strict. The social workers' assessments, the psychological tests, the endless paperwork, everything had been a challenge, but nothing compared to this moment where everything became real. There they were, about to meet the child who could become their daughter or son, or perhaps someone entirely unexpected. Jason and Michael had never imagined what this experience would be like. What did it mean to adopt a child? What did it mean to be parents? They knew the child they would adopt carried a difficult past, filled with emotional wounds that wouldn't be easily erased. Deep down, they knew that parenting wouldn't be simple, but they were willing to do whatever it took to offer this child the love and care they deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Rose is waiting for you inside," said a shelter worker, breaking the silence, before pointing to the door on the right. Mrs. Rose was the shelter coordinator, a woman with gray hair who seemed as tired as she was determined. They followed the path without saying a word, their hearts pounding in their chests, as if they were about to enter an unknown world, where right and wrong didn't seem so clear. Mrs. Rose led them into a simple yet cozy room. The walls were decorated with children's drawings and toys scattered across the floor. But the atmosphere wasn't joyful, not in the way they had imagined. There was a palpable tension in the air. And there, sitting in the corner of the room, was Ethan, a boy around 8 years old, with messy hair and eyes so deep that they seemed to carry a weight even his age couldn't explain. He didn't smile when he saw them. In fact, he barely lifted his eyes from his small hand, which was playing with a stone he had found on the ground. "This is Ethan," Mrs. Rose said, her voice mixing concern with empathy. "He has a difficult past. It has been a very hard time for him. But he's here now, trying to take the next step. He may not be what you expected, but he's all he can be. The adjustment won't be easy, and the road will be long." Jason and Michael exchanged a look filled with meaning. They knew what this meant. The boy was hurt. His soul, marked by pain they couldn't yet comprehend, would require patience, care, and much more than just the love they felt in their hearts. Ethan finally looked up at them. His eyes were empty, as if he no longer knew what to expect from the world. An uncomfortable silence filled the room as they watched him. "Hi, Ethan," Michael said gently, trying to calm the atmosphere. "We're Jason and Michael. We're here because we'd like to take care of you." The boy simply nodded. He didn't respond, didn't show any emotion. He was there physically, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere, in some dark corner of his memory where the warmth of love felt distant. Mrs. Rose made a subtle gesture, as if to give them a moment alone. "I'll leave you here for a while. Remember, it's not about rushing, but about each person's timing. The process will be difficult, and you need to be prepared." Jason and Michael were left alone with Ethan. The boy didn't seem interested in communicating. He curled up in the corner, holding his stone as if it were his only protection against the world. It was in that moment that Jason felt the weight of reality. This wasn't just about making a child happy. It wasn't just about giving him a roof and food. Ethan needed more. He needed something Jason didn't know if he could offer. Trust. I promise you, Ethan, we won't abandon you. It'll be hard, but we'll be by your side, Jason said, unsure if the boy would understand. But at that moment, he wasn't just speaking to the boy. He was speaking to himself, trying to convince himself that they were doing the right thing. The silence stretched on, and in the background, Mrs. Rose watched from a distance. She didn't know it yet, but the future they were beginning to write together would be marked by unexpected emotional challenges, a twist that would take them to dark places, and, in the end, could only be overcome by the strength of unconditional love. Jason looked at Michael, who was silent, his eyes misty. "I think we're ready," he murmured, though it was clear they had no idea what they were about to face. And as Ethan remained there with his empty eyes and the stone in his hands, Jason felt something else. Fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of not knowing how to handle the invisible pain the boy carried. But at the same time, he felt something stronger than fear, a desire to try to make things work. "We're going to take care of you," Jason said, now more to himself than to Ethan. And in that moment, their future changed forever. The silence in the room seemed to swallow every unspoken word. Ethan was still there, curled up in his corner with the stone in his hands. His gaze, distant and cold, showed no signs of wanting interaction. Jason and Michael exchanged looks, a mix of uncertainty and determination. What to do now? How to break the invisible barrier that seemed to separate them from Ethan? How to build a bond with a child so clearly closed off from the world? Michael was the first to try to take a step toward the boy. He crouched down, putting himself at Ethan's level, trying to reduce both the physical and emotional distance. "Ethan," Michael said, his voice soft, trying to sound comforting but not forcing an approach. "We don't want to scare you. We can be your parents. If you want, we just need a little time. Is that okay?" The boy didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the stone he held tightly. He didn't seem to be listening, or perhaps he was, but the fear was so deep that he didn't know how to react. The story behind those eyes wasn't an easy one to tell. It was a story of abandonment, neglect, a past marked by pain and the struggle to survive. Ethan wasn't an ordinary child. He carried the weight of a life that would be unimaginable for someone so young. Jason sat next to Michael, still unsure of what to do. He wanted to say something, but the words seemed inadequate. He wanted to heal all the boy's wounds, to be the hero who brought happiness to that child, but he knew that wouldn't be easy. "Ethan," Jason began, his voice more firm now, as if he were speaking to himself, trying to convince himself he was on the right path. "We understand that you're scared. We're not going to make you do anything you don't want to. We just want to show you that you don't have to face this alone." But Ethan didn't react. The boy was in a world of his own, lost in his own thoughts. The pain he carried seemed stronger than any attempt to get close. What he had lived before arriving here was something Jason or Michael couldn't imagine. Mrs. Rose had briefly mentioned Ethan's past, but her words were vague, enough to suggest the boy had a history of abuse and neglect that still haunted him. The pain of seeing such a disconnected child, so disillusioned with the world, tightened Jason's chest. He could feel the weight of the responsibility beginning to press on his shoulders. Fatherhood in that moment didn't feel natural or simple. It was a challenge that would require more than patience and love. It was something deep, something that would force them to confront their own fears, their own limitations. After a few minutes of silence, Michael let out a sigh, almost imperceptible. He was tired of trying to talk to Ethan, but at the same time, he didn't know what else to do. He looked at Jason, his eyes empty of answers. "Do you think he'll ever open up to us?" Jason looked at the boy, but didn't have an immediate answer. He didn't know. There was no way to know. What he did know was that they couldn't give up. They were here to stay, to give everything they had, even without knowing what that meant. They were here because somehow destiny had brought them to this point, to this room in front of Ethan, and then something unexpected happened. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes, not directly to Jason or Michael, but toward the nearby window where the faint moonlight was entering, softly illuminating the wall with a quiet gentleness. He stared at the light for a moment as if trying to understand something, and then almost imperceptibly whispered, "I won't let you hurt me." Ethan's words were like a sharp blade, cutting through the silence of the room with a chilling clarity. Jason and Michael exchanged glances, surprised, but also touched. They had expected many things, but never something so direct. Ethan's fear, his distrust, was there, raw and exposed before them. But there was something else, too. There was a need to protect himself, a resistance to the idea of surrendering to love as if he believed that any attempt to get close to someone would only lead to more pain. And this, in some way, made Jason's heart weigh even heavier. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that it wouldn't be quick, but he was more determined than ever to try. "Ethan," Jason said, his voice full of restrained emotion, trying to reach the boy without forcing anything. "We don't want to hurt you, you understand? We're here to take care of you, to give you what you deserve. We just want to be a family." Michael placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, seeking support from one another. But the tension still hung in the air. They were only beginning to understand that earning Ethan's trust would be a long, hard journey. There would be no easy solutions, no magical moments of revelation. Being parents to Ethan meant navigating uncharted waters, facing the traumas he carried, and perhaps most importantly, learning to cope with their own vulnerability. Then, with a nearly imperceptible movement, Ethan stood up, still holding the stone in his hands. He stepped back a little more, moving toward the window, where he stared at the stars in the sky. His words, "I won't let you hurt me," echoed in Jason and Michael's minds. They knew that this was the first step, the first and painful step in a journey that would demand all the strength of their love, patience, and understanding. And the journey, though uncertain, was just beginning. The next day brought a slight improvement, but the tension still lingered over the house. Jason and Michael knew that for Ethan, the simple fact of them being there, trying to create a new reality for him, was a confrontation with everything he had already been through. They weren't strangers, but they weren't family either. And love or goodwill wouldn't be enough, for those things didn't heal the invisible scars he carried. That morning, Jason woke up early. The sun was still weak when he went down to the kitchen, seeking a bit of silence before facing the harsh reality of parenthood. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew that the challenge would not just be about bonding with Ethan. The boy was broken, marked by something far deeper, something that wouldn't be solved with empty promises or forced hugs. Michael entered the kitchen shortly after, wearing a serious expression, as if he already knew this would be another difficult day. He cast a tired glance at the coffee he was making. "Has he not left his room yet?" Michael asked, taking a cup and pouring the coffee with a slight tremor in his hands. "No, he's in there." "We heard the door close during the night," Jason replied, worry etched on his face. He didn't know what was going on inside Ethan's mind, but he felt the boy's isolation was becoming an increasingly unbearable weight. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," Michael said, his voice tinged with doubt. "Maybe we moved too fast." "He's not ready for this, Jason." Jason sighed, but knew they couldn't back down. They had made a promise to themselves that they were there for Ethan, and that he wouldn't be abandoned, as others had done before. The question was how to deal with the deep trauma of a boy who had been treated like he didn't matter for so long. "He's not ready for us, is that it? It's not like he can decide everything at once. But we also can't expect him to open up as if it's something simple," Jason said firmly, trying to instill confidence in Michael, even though he was also unsure. "We can't give up on him." Michael didn't respond immediately. He knew Jason was right, but he also felt the pain of seeing Ethan withdrawn, isolated in his own suffering. They were trying to be parents, but it seemed like every step they took only pushed the boy further away, and it left them in a limbo of frustration. However, what Jason and Michael didn't know was that the day would be different. When Ethan finally appeared in the living room, his posture was more tense than ever, and he refused to look directly at them. He had spent the entire morning alone in his room, staring at the stone as if it were the only object of stability in a world that didn't make sense. He walked over to the window, just observing the movement outside, as if everything that passed there didn't matter to him at all. It was obvious he was holding back, keeping himself at a distance from any attempt at connection. But there was something in his gaze that suggested he was beginning to accept their presence. He wasn't completely shut off, but he wasn't ready to give in either. "Ethan," Michael said, approaching him, but without making any sudden movements. He wanted to be careful, to respect the boy's space, but also knew that this thin line needed to be crossed. "I know this must be hard for you, but if you want, we can talk. About anything." Ethan didn't respond, but somehow Jason felt that the words had touched something inside him. Maybe it was Michael's calm voice, or perhaps the sincerity that came through it. But for a moment the boy hesitated. I don't need anyone," Ethan said, his voice low, almost inaudible. "I just don't want to be hurt anymore." Jason and Michael exchanged glances. It was hard to know how to respond. They had heard the fear in his voice, the pain hidden behind every word. But what could they do? How could they ease the agony of such a broken heart? "Ethan," Jason said gently, "we won't hurt you. We're not here to harm you. We just want you to know that if you want, we're here. For anything." The boy looked at him, his gaze heavy with distrust, but also with curiosity. He didn't know if he believed Jason's words. He had never known what true love was, what it meant to be truly protected. How could he trust two people who said they wanted to be his parents? There was a long silence, a tense space that seemed to never end. Then, without warning, Ethan abruptly turned and, still holding the stone, said, "I'm not like you. I can't be, no matter how much you try." With those words, he retreated to the corner of the room, pulling away even further. Jason and Michael remained silent, absorbing the impact of what the boy had said. It wasn't just a rejection of the idea of being part of a family. It was the voice of a child who for too long had been left behind, who no longer knew what it meant to be loved unconditionally. The challenge was intensifying. They didn't know what else they could do to help Ethan overcome his past. But one thing was clear: they couldn't give up on him. They were more committed than ever, willing to endure the hardships and the patience that would be required to help Ethan find peace. But that path wouldn't be easy, and soon they would realize that the real battle was only just beginning. The following month was a whirlwind of trial and error. Jason and Michael were starting to understand the nuances of Ethan's behavior better. The brief conversations and wide silences began to become the norm. The boy didn't speak much, but his gaze held a weight that would never be forgotten. Sometimes he seemed to open up, like when he lay next to Michael on the couch, his head resting on his chest. But one sudden move or a misplaced word would make him pull away, shrinking into an emotional shell irreparably distant. For Jason, the worst part was the feeling of helplessness. He looked at Ethan and saw a child who each day seemed more marked. Those empty, sad, distrustful eyes were always watching, as if searching for a reason to trust, a reason to believe. But Ethan's past was like an invisible wall, more impenetrable than anything Jason had ever encountered. That morning, the atmosphere felt different. Michael had gone to the store while Jason prepared for a day he knew would be decisive. Ethan had shown signs of restlessness, and Jason's fear in his chest grew stronger. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. The tension in the house was palpable. And then it was when Ethan, for the first time, approached Jason differently. It wasn't a direct request, nor a plea, but in that look there was something new, something fragile. The disconnection had lessened slightly. When Ethan took a blank sheet of paper and a pen, Jason knew something was about to be revealed. The boy sat at the table, the paper in front of him. He didn't seem anxious, but he didn't seem calm either. Jason watched from afar, unsure whether to approach or wait for him to take the initiative. He saw the movement of the pen gliding across the paper with a contained force, as if each word was a battle. Ethan finished writing and pushed the paper toward Jason. The man looked at him, confused. It was hard to understand what was happening. But when he took the paper, what he saw made his stomach churn. There, in those words, was a story he never could have imagined. "I was taken from my mother when I was 5. They left me with the man. He told me that if I told anyone, no one would believe me. I was a mistake. They told me that every day." Jason swallowed hard, the words burning in his mind. Ethan, so silent, so closed off, had opened up. The truth was there, raw and unfiltered. with no attempt to soften the pain. The man Ethan referred to wasn't just an abuser, but someone who had also destroyed his self-esteem, his trust. And worst of all, that past was staining their relationship now, creating an abyss that Jason knew could not be easily bridged. Ethan, I didn't know. You don't have to go through this anymore, Jason said, his voice faltering. He didn't know what to say. How could he comfort a child who had never known true safety? The boy looked at him with an empty expression, not immediately responding. But what he said with his eyes was clear. He didn't believe Jason's words. He didn't believe that anyone could truly save him after all this time. When Michael came home and saw the paper on the table, his face went pale. He immediately understood the weight of the revelation. What Jason and he had tried so desperately now seemed even more distant. The idea of rebuilding a broken child, someone who had never known what it was like to be truly loved, was almost impossible. But there was something more, something Jason and Michael hadn't considered. Ethan's reaction was one of flight. Instead of accepting the vulnerability that emerged in the words, he retreated even further. He fled to the backyard, as if the world inside the house was too small to contain him. That escape wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Ethan didn't know how to cope with his own pain, with the scars of what he had lived through. He somehow knew that those exposed words would create a bond between him and Jason, between him and Michael. But what he didn't know was how to trust. He didn't know how to let their unconditional love break down the barrier he had built so hard over the years. Jason and Michael were on the edge. They didn't know if their love would be enough to overcome that chasm. But one thing was clear, they couldn't give up on Ethan. And then, in a moment of desperation, Michael had an idea. He didn't know if it would be the answer to everything, but maybe it was the first step to saving Ethan from himself. Jason, what if we take him to therapy? Maybe he needs more help than we're able to give him. Jason paused for a moment. He'd thought about it before, but never had the courage to suggest it. Therapy was an unknown field for them, and the idea of exposing Ethan to more people, more unfamiliar faces, seemed like a new risk. But deep down, he knew it might be their only option. I think you're right, Jason said, finally agreeing. I don't know how to do it without pushing him further. But he needs help, Michael. He can't carry this weight alone. That night, the decision was made. The next day, they would search for a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. It was a small hope, but perhaps the only one left. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew they had to take that step, and it would be the first step for Ethan. The next day, Jason and Michael were determined to take action. They knew that taking Ethan to therapy wouldn't be simple. There was so much more involved than just an appointment. Taking the boy to a therapist meant exposing his past in a way he might not be ready to face. But Jason felt he had no choice. Ethan was sinking into a deep silence, and each passing day felt like a lost battle. The fear of losing the boy, of seeing him shut down even more, consumed them. That afternoon, Jason and Michael sat with Ethan at the kitchen table, the atmosphere still heavy with the unresolved tension from the night before. Ethan sat with his head down, his eyes fixed on the table's surface, as if trying to avoid any eye contact. Jason could feel the weight of the pain emanating from him. a pain that seemed greater than anything he and Michael could offer. "Hey, Ethan," Jason began, his voice soft but firm. "We need to talk about something important." Ethan lifted his head, but said nothing. He just watched them with a distant look, as if waiting for something else to be said, something that could change the course of things. "We know that what you've been through has been really hard. It's not going to be easy, but we want to try together to help you deal with it. That's why we decided that the best option would be for you to talk to someone who understands what you're feeling." Michael spoke this time, his voice more cautious, trying to be understanding. Ethan shook his head, but didn't say a word. It was as if he was trying to process it, but the walls inside him were so strong, so impenetrable, that he seemed unable to react. The idea of talking about it all, of putting the words out there, was such a heavy burden that he didn't know where to start. But something in Jason and Michael's gaze made him stay seated, not getting up and leaving the room like he had so many times before. After a long pause, Ethan finally murmured, his voice low and dragging, "I don't know if I can talk about it. It's too hard." Jason felt his heart tighten. This was what he had feared. The fear that Ethan would never be able to open up, that he would lose himself forever in his own suffering. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything they had already faced. "You don't have to do this alone, Ethan," Jason said firmly. "You have us. We're here to support you, always." The boy looked at him, his eyes a little softer but still filled with suspicion. It was as if he wanted to believe, but the fear of being disappointed, of being hurt again, still spoke louder. That night, the trio went to Dr. Whitaker's office, a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. The waiting room was silent, the soft light of the lamps reflecting on the walls. Ethan didn't look comfortable. He huddled in the chair, his eyes searching for an exit, anything that would make him feel he could escape. Michael tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but Ethan just ignored him. Jason felt a pain in his chest, seeing the boy so closed off, so distant. When they were finally called in, the three of them entered the therapy room. Dr. Whitaker, a middle-aged man with a calm and welcoming demeanor, greeted them with a smile. He asked them to sit and then asked Ethan if he was comfortable. But Ethan's response was just an empty gaze, void of emotion. "I know this can be very difficult, Doctor," Whitaker began, his voice soft, trying to create a safe environment. "But, Ethan, we're going to take it slow on your time. There's no rush. I just want you to feel comfortable enough to talk when you're ready." Ethan remained silent, not making any movement. Jason felt a pang of frustration, but stayed firm. Michael placed his hand over Jason's, a silent gesture of support. They couldn't force Ethan to talk. They couldn't make him face his past, but they were there to help him take the first step. The session passed slowly, with only a few words from Ethan. The boy was physically present, but mentally, he seemed to be in another place, locked in an invisible prison of pain and fear. When the session ended, Dr. Whitaker asked them to return next week. On the way home, the silence in the car was palpable. Ethan stared out the window, his eyes fixed on the road, but Jason knew he was distant. And if something didn't change, if he didn't start trusting at some point, all of this would be in vain. The idea that therapy might be the key to helping Ethan felt like a distant and uncertain light. But that night, something happened that Jason hadn't expected. While he was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Ethan entered the room with a notebook in his hands. He sat down at the table and, without saying a word, began to write. Jason and Michael exchanged surprised glances. What was Ethan doing? They waited, motionless, to see what he would do. When Ethan finished, he pushed the notebook forward. Jason approached and opened it. There were words, many words, words that hadn't been there before. What Ethan had written was a confession, an attempt to release what had been kept inside for so long. I'll never be like the other kids. I don't know what it's like to be loved. They always told me I was a mistake, that I didn't matter. But maybe I want to try. Maybe if you let me, I can learn to believe in you. Jason read those words silently. His heart raced. There it was, the key. There was the first crack. Ethan still didn't know how to trust completely, but he was starting to allow himself a little. The pain wouldn't disappear overnight, but that notebook, those words, were a sign that their journey was only just beginning. The following week, Jason and Michael felt the weight of expectation. They knew they couldn't push Ethan to move faster than he was ready to go, but with every small sign of progress, they felt more hopeful. The notebook he had left on the table that night was a turning point, a small victory that turned into a ray of light in the darkness. Ethan remained reluctant to speak, but his gestures were beginning to change. He accepted more affection, more signs of love, albeit shyly. However, moments of withdrawal were frequent. He seemed to hide a part of himself, as though the weight of his past was something he couldn't easily shake off. One of those quiet afternoons, Jason and Michael decided to do something they thought was important. Try to understand more about Ethan's past. They knew that to truly help the boy, they needed to comprehend the magnitude of what he had lived through before reaching them. Jason, with his determined approach, contacted the social services agency that had mediated the adoption and requested Ethan's history. When the envelope arrived, Michael had it in his hands. Jason didn't want to open it alone, so they decided to do it together, as they always did with everything. As they cut the seal, the smell of aged paper wafted out, as though the document carried the weight of a lifetime of suffering. They began reading the details contained within, learning what Ethan's past had in store for him. The boy had been taken from his biological parents when he was only 4 years old. The report detailed episodes of extreme neglect, domestic violence, and abuse. The words jumped off the page with an overwhelming weight, but what truly struck them were the accounts of Ethan being left without food for days and forced to live in unsanitary conditions. His parents had never shown any interest in caring for him, and as a result of this neglect, Ethan came to believe that he didn't deserve to be loved, that no one would ever want to take care of him. The hardest part to digest, however, was learning that Ethan had been a pass-through child for several foster families before coming to Jason and Michael. None of them had succeeded in keeping the boy for long. He ran away, rebelled, and the families thought the problem was with him. It's just a phase, they said. He has a difficult temperament. But no one looked deep enough to understand that the problem wasn't Ethan. It was how he had been treated. Each new failure added to the weight, and each new family distanced themselves from him, creating a deeper hole in his heart. Jason closed the report and looked at Michael. No words were spoken between them, but the silence spoke more than anything. It was as if the weight of all the suffering Ethan had lived through had infiltrated their own lives. "He's not a lost cause," Michael said, his voice cracking, breaking the silence. "We need to help him, Jason, in any way necessary." Jason nodded. He knew what that meant. Being Ethan's father wouldn't be like being the father of any other child. They would need to face many demons, his and their own. But nothing in their lives had been easy. And this wouldn't be either. The next morning brought a new challenge. During breakfast, while Jason was making the pancakes Ethan loved, the boy entered the kitchen, his expression as closed off as always. But something had changed in his gaze, something there that they couldn't identify right away. Ethan approached, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, which he handed to Jason with a hesitant movement. I wrote something else," Ethan said, his voice wavering. Jason took the paper and began reading. Ethan's words weren't as long as the last time, but still carried a depth that Jason wasn't prepared to process so quickly. "I feel like I'm carrying stones all the time. Each one is a mistake I made or something bad that happened. I don't know how to let this go. I know you want to help me, but I don't know how to let you in, and that scares me. I'm afraid that if I let myself feel, everything will fall apart. I'm afraid I won't be able to get back up." Ethan's words were raw, painful, but also full of a vulnerability he rarely let show. Jason felt a pang in his chest as he read them. Each sentence seemed like a silent scream that he didn't know how to respond to. Michael, sitting beside him, placed his hand over Jason's, which he squeezed lightly. They knew the road ahead would be long. Maybe Ethan would never fully rid himself of the pain, but he was trying to open up, trying to heal, and that was the most important thing. The following week, Ethan's therapy became another challenge. He was starting to feel more comfortable with Dr. Whitaker, but the process of talking about his traumas was still a constant struggle. He spoke in fragments, often getting lost in painful memories that came back in waves, making it hard to focus. With every small word he managed to say about his past, Jason and Michael felt closer to him. Then one day, after a particularly difficult session, Ethan did something unexpected. As they left the office, he held firmly onto Jason's hand, as if for the first time he truly believed he could trust someone. I want to try more. I want to try to be part of this. I don't want to be alone anymore." Ethan's words were like a balm for the wounds Jason and Michael carried. Even though the road ahead would be full of obstacles, something had changed. The boy was beginning to believe, allowing himself to be loved, realizing there was a future where he could heal his wounds. In the following months, Jason, Michael, and Ethan's life continued to be marked by highs and lows, but with a new sense of hope. Ethan still struggled with the ghosts of his past, but increasingly he was able to open up to them. The therapy sessions began to have a more visible impact, and he worked hard to face his fears, though still with much fear of losing control. It was during a peaceful weekend, a sunny morning when the trio was planning a walk in the park, that Jason's phone rang. It was social services, and when he heard Ethan's name on the other end of the line, Jason knew something was about to change. The woman's tone was serious, and even before she explained, he felt the pressure in his chest. "Mr. Archer," the woman began with a soft but firm voice, "unfortunately, we're contacting you to inform you that there's been a complication with Ethan's adoption. There's a possibility that he may have to be returned to the temporary foster system due to a claim made by one of his biological relatives. Jason felt his stomach drop. The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. What did this mean? He looked at Michael, who was sitting at the table, arranging the backpacks for their outing. Michael's face changed when he saw Jason's expression, and without knowing what was going on, he stood up. "What's she talking about?" Michael asked, his voice tense, the tone of someone who already knew the worst was coming. The worker continued, "Apparently there's a biological uncle of Ethan who filed a request to reverse the adoption. We're investigating his claim that the adoptive parents aren't prepared to properly care for Ethan. The court will assess the situation in the coming days." Jason felt his throat tighten. How could someone try to take Ethan away from him? They had done so much to show the boy that he wasn't alone anymore. This thought kept hammering in his head as he hung up the phone and looked at Michael, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. "No, this can't be happening," Michael said, his eyes watery. "He's not going back to that hell. Not after everything." Jason felt the pain spread throughout his body. The fear of losing Ethan, of having the boy ripped from their lives, was the worst feeling he had ever experienced. He knew he couldn't let this happen, but he also didn't know how to fight against the system that now seemed to be conspiring against them. The decision was being made in court, and at that moment they were at the mercy of bureaucracy and the unfounded allegations of a man who didn't understand Ethan's reality. In the following days, the pressure on Jason and Michael only increased. They met with lawyers, drafted documents, and sought support from anyone who knew them, trying to make a difference and convince the court that they were doing what was best for Ethan. However, deep down, a doubt gnawed at them. What if the child was taken away from them? What if, after all the work they had done, he was sent back to a system that had never truly welcomed him? But the worst was yet to come. When the day of the court hearing arrived, Jason and Michael prepared for a fierce battle. They were in the room, dressed formally, trying to hide the tension in their expressions. Ethan, beside them, was quieter than ever, as if the weight of everything happening was already too much for him. The door opened, and Ethan's biological uncle entered the room. A large man with a closed demeanor, he seemed like a mountain of resentment. He sat at the table, looking at Jason and Michael with a judgmental air. During the hearing, the uncle's lawyer argued that Ethan needed a more masculine figure in his life, that Jason and Michael weren't prepared to be ideal parents, and that the boy needed a traditional family. The lawyer's words were like sharp blades, and with each one Jason's heart seemed to crumble a little more. The judge, however, remained calm and asked to hear Ethan. The boy had been called to testify in a formal setting, which made him visibly uncomfortable. But Jason noticed something was happening. Ethan was more mature, stronger. He looked at the judge with an expression that, although nervous, was determined. And when asked who he wanted to be his family, Ethan's answer was clear and without hesitation. I want to stay with them," Ethan said, looking at Jason and Michael with confidence for the first time. "They didn't abandon me. They didn't leave me. I'm a part of them." Ethan's words, simple and direct, echoed through the room, and at that moment the courtroom fell silent. The judge, moved by the boy's testimony, looked at his biological uncle and, in a firm tone, announced his decision. "The court finds that Ethan is well cared for and making significant progress in the family environment provided by Jason and Michael. There is no reason to separate this family. The petition to revoke the adoption is denied. When the judge banged the gavel, Jason and Michael exchanged looks, relieved but exhausted. They had won, but the battle had been hard. Ethan, with his eyes shining, ran into the arms of Jason and Michael. They embraced him tightly, as if the whole world had stopped at that moment. In that hug, they knew the battle had been won. But they also knew that Ethan's healing journey wasn't over. The path would be long, but finally they were together. Jason, Michael, and Ethan's lives began to stabilize after the hearing. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted off their shoulders. Though the court victory was a win, the scars Ethan carried from his past were still there. He wasn't fully healed, but one thing was clear. He was no longer alone. And, more importantly, he knew he would never be abandoned again. The small apartment that Jason and Michael had bought in a quiet neighborhood was fuller than ever. The environment, which once felt sober and practical, now had touches of life. Toys scattered on the floor, drawings hung on the walls, and laughter filling the silent corners. It was as if the house had truly become a home, a place where the pain of Ethan's past was slowly replaced by moments of joy. But the road to healing wasn't easy, and Jason knew that. Even with the legal battle over, the work with Ethan was just beginning. In the first months after the court decision, the boy still closed himself off from time to time. He would stay in his room, sometimes avoiding even Michael's most loving glances, as if their love was something hard to believe. It was on one of those difficult days that Jason made a decision. He remembered something that Ethan's therapist had once said: "Healing doesn't happen by decree. It happens in its own time, and every small victory counts." So, Jason decided he would make sure Ethan felt like he could be himself, without rushing, without pressure, but also without hiding any more than necessary. On a Saturday afternoon, Jason and Michael decided it was time to show Ethan that he had a family that believed in him, that was there to support him without reservation. They invited him for a walk in the park, but it wouldn't be just any walk. Jason knew this could be a turning point, a chance to rebuild Ethan's trust in the world around him. They had planned a simple, yet meaningful surprise: a day at the zoo. "Let's get out of the house and take a stroll, Ethan. No stress. Just the three of us and a few adventures along the way," Michael said with a wide smile as he grabbed the car keys. Ethan looked at him with suspicion, but a spark of curiosity gleamed in his eyes. It was as if he was starting to allow himself to be a little lighter, to let go of the rigidity he had been carrying. The trip was peaceful, with little conversation, but many knowing glances exchanged between the three of them. When they arrived at the zoo, the surroundings seemed like a new world to Ethan. He had never had the chance to enjoy something so simple and joyful. Walking among the animals, Jason and Michael's laughter and Ethan's curious comments made the time pass differently. Something in the air, in that space filled with life, seemed to touch Ethan's heart. As they walked through the monkey area, Ethan approached a fence and observed closely. There was a small group of monkeys playing, swinging, and spreading out across the area. Ethan looked at Jason and Michael, his eyes reflecting a mixture of emotion and understanding. "I never thought it could be this simple," he said in a low voice, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the two men beside him. I keep thinking about how I was stuck in such hard things for so long. And here, it's just me and you guys." Jason felt his chest tighten. The pain he saw in Ethan's eyes was something he could never fully understand, but he knew how much it meant to hear those words. Ethan was beginning to accept the love he offered, the love Michael also offered, and that was all they could ask for. Michael, who was by his side, stepped forward and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You'll never have to hide from us, Ethan," he said softly. "You have our family, and that's never going to change. Never." And then, as if time had slowed for a moment, Ethan smiled. It was a small, shy smile, but full of a sincerity that touched both men's hearts. The feeling that he was starting to believe in the truth that here, in this family, he had a safe place, was almost tangible. In the days that followed, their dynamic began to change, not drastically, but with the naturalness of someone reconnecting with the world after years of pain. Ethan gradually began to open up, more comfortable showing his feelings, and even smiling more often. Jason and Michael knew the healing process would be long and often challenging, but they were more united than ever, and that was all Ethan needed. A few weeks later, Ethan brought home a drawing. It was simple. A house, 3 figures inside it, with a heart in the center. He looked at them with a sparkle in his eyes and said with a somewhat shy smile, "It's our house, the family I chose." Jason and Michael exchanged a look, and words got stuck in their throats. There was nothing more to say. What they were living, what they had achieved, didn't need words. The hug that would follow that moment was enough to express everything their hearts were saying. In the end, Ethan didn't need anything more than that. He didn't need proof, justifications, or anything else. He had found what he always wanted, a family that loved him unconditionally, without reservation. A family that was willing to fight with him, for him, so he could have a real chance at happiness. And so, in that small apartment with walls vibrating with laughter and life, they began to build, day by day, the future they all deserved.